Archaeology News, the news you can trust.
All right, for today's archaeology news, we have a bunch of stories from around the globe because it has been a busy 2025 thus far. We're going to start out right in the middle in an area at the heart of the Silk Road in Central Asia called Sogdiana. And this is right in the present-day Stan, so Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, etc. And the people who hailed from there were known as Sogdians, but not much is actually known about them. They were merchants and traders who rose to prominence during the golden age of the Silk Road from the 7th to 10th centuries AD, when the Tang dynasty in China was also at its peak. And I have a warm place in my heart for Xi'an, China, as I did live there for a time. Now, the Sogdians were depicted in art spanning the full length of the Silk Road, from Persia to China. And here's a depiction of those Sogdians at Persepolis, the old ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, which was eventually captured by Alexander the Great. And in this view, they look pretty, well, Persian, right?
Right.
But they're also shown in artwork and paintings way over in China, and here they're shown in a very Chinese style. However, a new ancient DNA study into two Sogdian individuals found buried together in a tomb shed some light on all of this. I do think it's being a little bit oversold, but more about that later. The tomb was discovered in Ningxia, which is sort of in the middle of China, not too far from that Tang dynasty capital in Xi'an. So this is far outside of the Sogdian heartlands in Central Asia. Excavated back in 2014, the tomb was full of the sorts of material culture that's now associated with the Sogdians, like these figurines, but also symbols of their place in Chinese society, like these Tang Dynasty coins. However, the aDNA results reported in the publication do add an interesting twist. You see, we're used to putting people in boxes, thinking of them as genetically harmonious, like this ethnic group came from here and they're from this line of descent. However, there are many ethnic groups who migrate, and there are also those known as middlemen minorities. These are groups who are widely dispersed in many different societies, often engaged in trade and commerce. And for these types of folk, genetic homogeneity might not really be an option. For example, Jewish people across the world look very different despite a lot of shared cultural and religious traditions. And this is basically what the study found. If you look at the man's descent, he looks like a Central Asian based on his aDNA. However, the woman looks typically East Asian, what you'd find among the Chinese. And that's what we saw a few weeks ago with our episode about the Avar DNA project. Remember, the Avars were also Central Asians who transplanted themselves elsewhere. In their case, they were in Europe, and they overlapped in time with the Sogdians. Now, they remained quite culturally distinct, but as we saw, some of them did intermarry with local women. And in my own work, we're seeing this in early medieval England, where people buried in a purely Anglo-Saxon style are actually of Celtic or mixed descent. However, my gripe with this paper is what I mentioned earlier. These conclusions are drawn from just two burials taken to be man and wife based on how they're buried together. Huge errors of interpretation based on just a few genetic samples have been made before, including one particularly egregious case which messed with the entire history and cultural identity of the island nation of Vanuatu, causing it to be rewritten and rewritten again. So it's a cool paper and project, but let's not jump to conclusions, all right? The next story weaves together a few different themes we've discussed before, including Indigenous archaeology and microware analysis. Now for this one, we are off to Sunbury, which is a suburb of Melbourne in Victoria, Australia. And this sits right in the traditional homeland of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people. Sorry, I know I botched that, but as I've never heard a lot of Australian Aboriginal names pronounced properly, pardon my ignorance.
You ruined everything, you stupid.
Anyway, so this particular group of Aboriginal people is represented by the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung Cultural Heritage Aboriginal Corporation, who represents the group's interests in the area and protects their cultural heritage. And one thing this area has lots of: earthworks, essentially raised circular mounds that have been there for who knows how long, and for what purpose, we don't know. There used to be hundreds of them all around, but a lot of development and lack of preservation means just about 100 remain. And as my personal focus is England, this is not something entirely unknown to me. You see, the country is dotted with these circular earthworks and enclosures. For example, this one at the Trundle, which is a Neolithic earthwork within an Iron Age hill fort in West Sussex in the south of the country. I did a survey there in 2023. No one knows what either the Neolithic earthworks or the Iron Age hill fort were actually for, but that's another story. Well, that's the same thing for these Aboriginal earthen circles in this area of Victoria. No one is quite sure what they signify. So, in a sign of the times, with the improving relationships generally between Aboriginal groups and archaeologists, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung Cultural Heritage Aboriginal Corporation and a group of archaeologists from all over Australia from different universities collaborated to try to figure this question out. What do these earthworks mean? Many previous excavation surveys and studies of the earthworks have been done in the past, presumably without collaboration of the local indigenous people. And these have indicated some of the archaeological remains to be as old as 15,000 years. And in one of those studies in 1979, a group of archaeologists excavated what was known as Sunbury Ring G and found tons of stone artifacts. The current study aimed to date the mound more precisely and study the artifacts. So first, for the dating, the team re-excavated the mound, collecting in the process lots of layers of rocks and sediment. And remember, those layers are called stratigraphy, really the bread and butter of archaeology. And if you want to know more about that, look at my ABCs of Archaeology episode about that topic. And in the absence of really a lot of organic remains, the team relied on something called optically stimulated luminescence, which is a way of dating where you can estimate the last time, I believe, that the sun struck the rocks in the formation. So they were buried after that. And that indicated the mound to be anywhere from 590 to 1400 years old. They also analyzed the many stone artifacts found on site, using lithic studies to try to figure out the purpose of stone tools, looking for signs of heat and residues, and at the micro-wear patterns. Putting all these analyses together, they identified some of the stone tools as for ceremonial scarring of human skin and or to create bird feather adornments, while others were used to process animal remains for consumption, basically butchering. Also, some of the fragments had been subject to intense heat, suggesting that campfires were built in this area. It's important to understand that these observations and interpretations were not made just using the science alone, but actually in close consultation with the Aboriginal groups, who did weave in their cultural practices and memories to aid in the interpretation. Hence, this study establishes this locality as a place where the ancestors of the Woiwurrung-speaking people lived and worked, traveled to and through for both practical and ritual purposes. And you can take a drink. But seriously, this is another powerful and encouraging example of Indigenous archaeology at work with professional archaeologists. And finally, let's go for some fun in the sun in the French Riviera, where it appears our ancient ancestors did very much the same thing. The specific site is found in Cavalaire-sur-Mer, not far from the famous town of Saint-Tropez. And here, an urban rehabilitation project was taking place in this town center, which doesn't particularly surprise me, as a lot of these towns, though beautiful naturally, are graced with architecture from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And of course, in old Europe, when you build something, you definitely need to have an archaeological survey done.
I think that's old Europe.
Now, in the US or UK, this is typically done by private contractors, but in France, it's usually the job of the government. The agency in this case is known as INRAP. That's the National Institute for Preventative Archaeological Research, which is what they call rescue archaeology, preventative. And they found something pretty amazing in this place. Perhaps the best preserved Neolithic village in Europe, and the second oldest one found in France. And it is from the Cargill culture. But what does that mean, Cargill? Remember, in archaeology, when we're looking at really ancient prehistoric cultures and societies, we often name them by what their pottery looked like, because that's usually all that survives or the best surviving stuff. And in this case, we call it Cargill because it's decorated with motifs that are made using the cardium shell. Now, I never knew that's what it was called, but trust me, you've seen these things before at the beach. This Cargill culture spread from Anatolia, which is present-day Turkey, westward along the Mediterranean about 8,500 years ago, and it lasted for about 1,000 years. Now, it's not the sexiest stuff, but it is definitely distinct from other pottery cultures you would have found in Europe and the Mediterranean during this time. So, during the early construction phases on this project, or maybe in the pre-construction survey, somebody noticed something funny at a depth of about 4 meters or 13 feet and decided to call the excavation team in. The dead giveaway was certainly these shards of clearly Cargill-ware pottery, but that was only the beginning. They then discovered a house with 2 parallel stone walls and an apse measuring 5 by 7 meters or 16 to 23 feet. And as archaeologists dug away to try to find the edges of the site, they eventually uncovered an extensive area of 4,200 meters squared or 46,000 square feet. It was huge. Really too much to handle, actually.
That's what she said.
Seriously, though, the dig continued through the end of 2024, and as far as I know, is still ongoing. Dating evidence points to about 4,800 BC, or almost 7,000 years ago, and the way the houses are designed do have parallels of stuff found in Italy. Only one older example from the early Cargill period was found in France, and it's not as extensive as this site. Due to development and preservation, open-air sites like this are rare. Most sites from this period in time are found in caves because that's usually better preserved, and we've seen a lot of those already on this show. Anyway, that'll do it for this episode of Archaeology News. We've been to China and Central Asia, Australia and France, so it is time to give it a rest. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.